Welcome to Stab the Dragon for episode number 97, book review number 8, The Vikings, From Odin to Christ, by Martin Whittock and Hannah Whittock. Oxford, Lion Hudson Limited, 2018, 255 pages. I read this book October of 2022 to February of 2023. And my evaluation is this is another outstanding book. It's now my third book review that I've read about Vikings in the past 7 months or so. I've reviewed The Vikings by Elsa Rosedahl, Penguin Books, 1999, revised edition. And I've read The Conversion of Scandinavia by Anders Winroth, Yale University Press, 2014. Now, Rosedahl's book is a general introduction to the study of the Vikings, and it's the most difficult of the three to read, but I still highly recommend it. Its focus seems to be on the archaeological record and wants to paint a picture of the Vikings that is different from the standard warrior pirate view. Winroth's book is looking at the subject matter that I'm more interested in, the conversion of the Scandinavians. Why did the Vikings choose to convert when they weren't forced to? But Winroth approaches his subject as more of a skeptic, I think, focusing on the political and social reasons for their conversion. And I go along with his evaluation, but the skepticism there I think he's approaching their matters of faith and religion as an outsider to the faith, perhaps. And I don't know anything about Winroth's personal views, his personal religious life. I don't know. But just the skepticism comes through in that book to me. However, his book is excellent and well worth the read, so I highly recommend it as well. But Whittock's book is, I think, the best of the three, or at least it's my favorite. Maybe somebody with more experience than me would be able to evaluate them differently. But Whittock is also focused on the conversion of the Vikings, but he is writing from the position of a Christian. That's clear in the biography of Whittock at the back of the book. Now, does this affect his book in any negative way? Is he biased in his approach? I think not. If anything, I believe his faith enhances his understanding of the subject. He clearly shares many of the same conclusions as Winroth, including that Viking kings frequently made decisions about religion based upon very materialistic and temporal goals. Whittock, though a believer, does not paint a rosy picture here of the conversion of the Vikings. He does show that they were a complex people in complex situations and made the decision to convert for really a variety of reasons. And there's different attitudes towards conversion within the Viking heroes of the faith, if you will. Both Winroth and Whittock admit it took a long time and a gradual process for different groups of Vikings to convert. It seems to me that even though Rosedahl's book is the general history, Whittock's book gives the better account of the Vikings as a whole, at least the more readable account, the more historical account. Rosedahl goes into greater detail about the archaeological record than either Winroth or Whittock. And I understand her reasons for doing that. But Whittock is the better storyteller here, and I think that's important for history. Now, again, keep in mind that Rosedahl's book is a translation, and that presents its own difficulties. But I think all three books complement each other very well, and I'm very happy to have chosen these three to begin my Viking journey. In the title, From Odin to Christ, here in Whittock, in the introduction on page 1, we get the clear purpose of the book. He writes, while placing the Vikings in their pagan context, our main aim is to explore what happened to Vikings when they converted to Christianity. Whittock continues on page 3, we're seeking in this book to correct the overemphasis in popular culture on the Odin-worshipping warriors of film and fiction. Now, both Rosedahl and Winroth say similar things. So that seems to be a priority with these historians of the Vikings, is they look at what's going on in our culture with Vikings and say, wait a minute, you guys have got it all wrong. And they want to correct that. And I think all three books have a similar approach in that regard. There's none of these three books that I think would contradict each other. They're all not in lockstep, but certainly in the same uh, point or thrust as each other. Now, prior to reading Winroth and now Whittock, I had no real sense of Vikings being converted or being a part of Christendom, although I knew, because of all the church history that I had in seminary, that eventually, hey, Scandinavia was part of Christendom. But I didn't know how that happened. And when you look at some of the uh, general histories of church histories, what goes on in Scandinavia during the medieval time period is really minimalized. I mean, there's just not a lot there. Later on, yes, there is more. But so these books that I've read, all three of them, really fill in a significant gap in my education. So I'm thankful for that. Now, Whittock illustrates his point by writing, rulers such as Harold Bluetooth of Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, Canute the Great of Denmark and England, William of Normandy, Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden, and Sigurd the Crusader of Norway would all have seen themselves as part of mainstream European civilization. In contrast to 21st century pluralism, they saw only one way to achieve that: Christianity. This book looks at why they felt this way. Page 3. And boy, that paragraph by Whittock is really amazing. I mean, he lists ruler after ruler from all three countries of Scandinavia and says, hey, to be European, to join in that civilization meant being Christian. And wow, that speaks to this day, today, our day, hugely. In chapter 1, The Pagan Vikings, he gives us several reasons for the sudden explosion of Vikings on the world scene, an increase in population in Norway, which had a very limited supply of arable land. And that's where details like that is where Rosedal is very, very helpful. I mean, she basically says there's only like 3% arable land in Norway. And this led many to cross the seas in search of farmland. So the Vikings as farmers is a huge theme in all three books. Internal power struggles led Viking chieftains to take their men and go looking for loot or land. Improved shipbuilding also led to more journeys of exploration, trade, and settling in new lands. Then there was the aggression of the Franks to the south of Denmark, which led many Danes to go on Viking raids. The surprise reason, though, that Whittock gives, and he discusses this theme in a few places throughout the book, is the changes going on in the Islamic world as the Abbasid dynasty displaced the Umayyad, and the power shifts from Damascus to Baghdad because the Swedish Vikings utilized the rivers of Russia to reach Islamic lands by the Caspian and the Black Seas for trade. These changes in the Islamic world caused ripples throughout the entire Viking world that affected England and France. An amazing story, really. What happens in the world of Islam still affects the West. There you go. And I need to say that Winroth says the same thing about the effects of the Islamic world on the Vikings and how it ripples through the rest of the world. But reading this book, along with the previous two, has taught me a lot about the geography of the British Isles and the North Atlantic. And really, man, I'm confessing just ignorance here of the history of England. I never took a history of England course in my historical studies. And so I'm just ignorant of geography and history there. And so these books have really taught me a lot about English history and the geography of the North Atlantic. Whittock covers how the Vikings and the Irish, this is important, settled the islands around Britain and in the Atlantic, like the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Hebrides, and the Faroes, not to mention Iceland and Greenland. And this was a fascinating area for me. Whittock has really whetted my appetite for studying some Irish history now, because the role of the Irish in all of this was significant. And again, it's something that I was totally unaware of. His chapter, Storm from the North, second chapter, it gives an outstanding survey of the first surge of Viking raids in Britain, along with a lot more detail in English history than I would have thought possible. The background to the raid on Lindisfarne was excellent, and then he moves into the coast of Northwest Europe and back into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And so this back and forth demonstrates two strengths of the book. One, he presents the history following both a chronological and a geographical line of thought in a way that is not confusing to me. And two, he packs a tremendous amount of material that is both deep and wide into a book that is scarcely over 250 pages. Whittock points out one of the results of these Viking raids across England. Alfred of Wessex would go on record to claim that all centers of learning had been destroyed in England in Viking attacks. In support of Alfred's claims, very few pre-Viking land charters, written records of gifts of land kept in monasteries, survive. This indicates both a great loss of church libraries and records and a decline in the standards of literacy, page 30 of Whittock. Here's a great lesson applicable to today. When barbarians invade, either from without or from a new ideology arising from within, let the listener be alert to this, they destroy the old religions, the old libraries and art forms and education system. We see that in the churches and universities and public schools in America today. We see it with, a few years ago, the destruction of so many statues in self-righteous indignation at this nation's history. Amazing. Now, the meat of the book's thesis is explored in chapter 3, the Viking conversion in England. Whittock mentions the violent, forceful conversion technique of Charlemagne, as does almost every other author of medieval history books written everywhere, I suppose. And he discusses the damage done to the church by the pagan Vikings, possibly in retaliation. But then the author pivots to show how the Vikings were keen to fit into the Christian expectations of how a king should rule and behave, page 47. He writes about the speed of assimilation of the Scandinavians into English culture and Christianity. Quote, very large numbers of people of Scandinavian identity settled in England, but they were drawn from a community which rapidly decreased its ethnic signals and adapted itself to Anglo-Saxon Christian burial customs in place of its traditional pagan practices. The Vikings appear to have soon adopted the lifestyle and beliefs of the English. The Viking impact was certainly dramatic, but it lacked cultural depth. Within 2 generations at most, Christian continuity won out over pagan change, pages 48 and 49. Now, that quote is just amazing. It shows how the pagan invasion of England was not backed up with enough troops, enough Scandinavians. And so they intermarried, they were absorbed, they went back home, they died, the next generation took over and they spoke English instead of Scandinavian, Old Norse. And so things were changed. The Christian culture won out over the pagan Scandinavian culture. Chapter 12 of Whittock's book, The First American Christians. is the mother lode for me, and it's what I was looking for in this journey into Viking history. He gives the best overview of why and how the Vikings discovered America and stresses the fact that their being part of Christendom is a legitimate part of the story. He utilizes the primary sources from the sagas, the Icelandic sagas, as well as the archaeology of lands on meadows in Newfoundland to piece together the likely stories with their variations. It seems to me that all the general history books leave this side of the Viking story out totally. The questions posed by Whittock at the start of this chapter are so startling in their simplicity, yet so shocking in what they say about our education system and our modern day understanding of our own past, that this chapter alone is worth the price of the book. Quote, today, if one asked a modern citizen of the USA or Canada to name the first Christian buried in North America, they might come up with the name of one of the sailors who accompanied the voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492. They might think the first Christian born in America was either a Spanish colonist or a Mayflower settler, and the first Native American baptized as a Christian would be someone converted during the Spanish settlement in the Caribbean. Or perhaps they might jump forward in time and name Pocahontas, who converted to Christianity in Virginia in the early 17th century. It is highly unlikely, Whittock continues, that anybody would suggest that the answer to the first question is Thorvald Eriksson, brother of Leif the Lucky, or that the answer to the second question is Snorri Thorfinnsson, the child of Thorfinn Karlsefni and Gudrid Thorbjorn's daughter. Thorbjorn's daughter. Yeah, trying to read Old Nordic is interesting. Who had sailed to North America from Brattahlid, Greenland. Or that the answer to the third question is two Skraeling children captured on Markland by the companions of Thorfinn Karlsefni and Gudrid Thorbjorn's daughter. Page 175. Perhaps the only weakness in the book is the paucity of information about the southern journeys and exploits of the Vikings in the Iberian coast and the Mediterranean and North Africa. Some mention of the Vikings in the Eastern Roman Empire and Constantinople are certainly in the book, but not in as much depth as I would wish. I imagine the reason is that the central thrust of Whittock's book is the conversion of the Vikings, and the southern voyages simply didn't have much to do with that. The Vikings were sailing and traveling, raiding and trading, exploring and settling from the Caspian Sea to Newfoundland, Canada, and from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. They were fierce warriors for sure, wily merchants, stable farmers, and masters of the seas, oceans, and river systems. By way of application, there is some comfort to Christians in the West who look around and realize the modern-day pagans have conquered Christendom. We should be like Alcuin, who, upon hearing of the raid on Lindisfarne, wondered about our sins that may have brought this disaster upon our heads. Perhaps, in time and with God's grace, we, the conquered, will be used of God to win the hearts and minds of the conquerors in a couple of generations as they look around at the ruins of this once great civilization, what was once Christendom, and say, like the Vikings of old, what they have is better than what we have. Let us become like them. Let us become Christians. This book is now on my all-time favorite history books list. It has created within me a thirst for more study of the Vikings, of the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, the Scots, the Franks, and the Germans. This book is wonderful. I started this study of the Vikings as a part of my studies of early American history, but now I'm drawn to our European roots and to Christendom. Whittock has wonderfully answered my questions about the Viking discovery of America and the conversion of the Scandinavians. I heartily commend this book and suggest it is not just for those interested in the conversion of the Vikings, though that's its main thrust. If you want one book to introduce you to Viking history and the Viking discovery of America, I would say this is the book. again, I'm glad to have read all three. And again, if you want to study the conversion of the Scandinavians, Winroth would be my second choice. Absolutely, another wonderful book. And then to cover the rest of the background of the Vikings, Elsa Rosedal's book, The Vikings, is certainly a good place to begin. So all three books are marvelous, but the Whittock book wins for me as the best of the three so far. I'm going to be probably reading another book or two on the Vikings as I continue this Viking journey. But for now, Stab the Dragon out here.